you're not going to talk about any of the good stuff that happened in 2020?
Not really. It was kind of a terrible year. Kind of makes you want to invest in portable living.
So nothing good happened at all? That makes Wombo sad.
Well, there was some cool weed laws passed, right? We don't really talk about the other good things the last election did, I guess. Recreational marijuana is now legalized in Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, South Dakota, plus Oregon and DC decriminalized a bunch of other drugs, and that's actually pretty amazing, especially if you were alive during the DARE years. We're starting to, albeit slowly, reduce prison sentences for pot. LGBTQ rights had a similar boost last year too. Utah banned conversion therapy, pretty bare minimum, but thanks Utah. Way to limp toward progress. Also, the Supreme Court ruled that the 1964 Civil Rights Act protects LGBTQ individuals from getting fired, so that's also good. And it probably should be noted that Neil Gorsuch, Donald Trump's first appointee to the Supreme Court, ruled on the right side of history. Unlike Trump's second appointee, Brett Droopy Sad Boy Rapist Kavanaugh, and it probably should also be noted that Kavanaugh and Gorsuch both did vote to reject the appeal of Kim Davis, that lady who tried to deny marriage licenses for same-sex couples. So, an overall victory in the courts, both despite of and thanks to a few of Trump appointees. But also, just to be clear, we aren't looking at all the many other rulings from 2020 and making a judgment on these people. It's just nice to know that everything isn't definitely bad all the time, or definitely good. That Amy Coney Barrett, for example, has been pretty center to left so far in her rulings, and most of Trump's judges have not supported his claims of election fraud, nor did any of them side with Trump over the release of his taxes. Again, they're all still conservative judges and will undoubtedly side against progress in the future, but it's still good news, or at least not bad news. It's just news, folks. And I don't know, maybe that puppet and boar guy and whatever the third one was, maybe they were right, and I could have done an easier job of highlighting the stuff that's not terrible. Other really cool historical stuff the 2020 election gave us is Sarah McBride, our first openly transgender state senator. Cori Bush became the first black woman to represent Missouri. Then in New York, we had Mondaire Jones and Richie Torres become the first black and Afro-Latino members of Congress who were also LGBTQ. So that's all gravy. Also, unrelated, but in Denver, they repealed a ban on pit bull ownership. So that's a win for anyone who likes those dopey, swole-ass babies. Look at this dumb What an asshole! Anyway, yeah, I skipped some good news, I guess. When I mentioned the net neutrality stuff, maybe I should have added that Ajit Pai has already stepped down and has been replaced by someone who might actually restore those laws. And that California is already enforcing their own net neutrality laws as we speak. And we're starting to see some other Trump-era villains get taken down a notch. That Louis DeJoy guy. You know the guy who sure seemed to be trying to undermine the USPS. Sure seems to be determined to stay on. And that's a dick move. And it's weird that Biden can't just fire him, I guess. But the good news is that the Postal Service's Board of Governors currently has 3 vacant seats to fill. And nominating people to fill those happens to be Biden's job. Something he's now doing. This would create a Democratic majority on this USPS board and enable them to fire DeJoy if they need to. But also, don't necessarily want to either, as it currently stands that they are giving him a shot for some stupid reason. But overall, the situation is generally good, because even though DeJoy is hanging around and the post office isn't doing so hot, the power has shifted to the Democrats and Biden who, in this case, happen to have the right idea about what the post office should be. Specifically, they are heavily against privatizing it, and at least seem to understand that it shouldn't be considered a business expected to make a profit. So even though the USPS isn't doing well, the people in charge also don't expect it to, and are reversing the efforts to cut back on days and charge more for postage, and also want cool electric cars, so that's neat too. Electric stuff is neat. I mean, who knows if any of this will happen, because it sure seems like Biden is not quite doing a bunch of stuff he said he was gonna do, but it's a start, I guess. Yay, progress. Be happy? Not bad news? Just news. Which is not bad. Still, there's a lot of other good things happening in the world in terms of not dicking the environment. When I talked about the wildfires, climate change, missing species, Australia's exports and all that, I guess it might be nice to also mention that Australia is starting to export renewable energy too. And we actually found a lost species last year that we assumed had died out. And other endangered species are thriving in some places. And there are big, otherwise sinister companies that use 2020 to commit to big renewable energy pledges. And some that actually met their goals. And in fact, renewable energy continued to grow in 2020 despite the pandemic. We actually had the first ever successful flight of an all-electric plane in 2020. And if that keeps going, if we keep advancing electric planes, that's actually like really good for reducing some carbon emissions. Not to mention that Sweden is right now developing a wind-powered cargo ship, something we super need considering that large ships are basically just trash dicks dragging through the ocean. Heck, even NASCAR is finding ways to be carbon neutral, not to mention bare minimum not racist, what with the banning of Confederate flags. And hey, that's another good thing from 2020. Mississippi removed their Confederate state flag. Remember all those protests concerning Confederate statues? Well, it turns out that we removed like 100 of those things, which is a start. Do we have a clip? We do not. Geez, I talked about some bummer international news, but failed to mention all of the positive stuff happening around the world that fell through the cracks. Africa is free from wild polio, so that's good. I'm generally anti-polio. Also things I'm anti: terrorism. And while we certainly have degrees of that going on in the United States, worldwide, we're actually at a 5-year low. Other things that are globally low is that hepatitis nobody likes. Maternal mortality, as in women dying due to childbirth. That's also getting low, but still an issue. We generally got a lot of medical breakthroughs in 2020, such as a new blood cancer vaccine and the world's first artificial eye with a 3D retina with capabilities that might exceed human vision. Literally Star Trek shit. This actually needs stressing because it's also one of the only good things to come out of the pandemic, which is that our science community actually became more global in 2020 because of COVID. It was the fastest a vaccine has come out ever. The way one scientist put it was that they achieved 10 years worth of work in just 11 months. And it was done because of a global cooperation that transcended governments. Again, Star Trek shit. The results of which aren't just going to change how we deal with viruses in the future, but how we do science in general. I mean, just to be clear, the disruption of a global pandemic definitely halted a lot of important non-virus research and negatively impacted the community as well. But you know how we thought a disaster like aliens or whatnot would unite the world, and then it didn't actually do that? Well, it sort of did do that thing, just only for scientists, so, neat. There were a lot of uplifting things I could have mentioned. When I brought up prisons, which are bad, I could have at least pointed out that Biden did order the DOJ to end private prisons, or that imprisonment rates for minorities in the US have been on a steady decline. It feels like drops in the bucket changes, but it's still worth reporting, because it means that it wasn't all hopeless, that there are hints of justice to come out of 2020, like how, yes, so many cops are now seeing zero consequences and having charges dropped when they were clearly guilty of murder. But at least the protesters who were arrested last year are also having their charges dropped. Like in large numbers, protesters are having their charges dissolved because civil liberties and stuff. It's bare minimum, folks, but also kinda nice to see this vindication reaching people associated with Antifa, And just to have the FBI director get up in front of the country and flat out say that Antifa isn't a problem, and in fact it's the FA who we should have been worried about, and to feel like perhaps the world is making a little more sense again. And so ultimately, when you take away the virus, 2020 still wasn't a great year, but not the worst. And it did end with election results that were more good than bad. And a lot of bad things were offset by some good stuff. And I don't know, maybe we don't have to land on a hard verdict here. Maybe 2020 was just kind of muddled and underwhelming and sort of canceled itself out. And we can all just forget it ever happened. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.